John is writing about the Word, the eternal Word. John is writing about the true light, which enlightens everyone that was coming into the world. And about this true light, he writes this. Hear God's word. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Eugene Peterson renders this little section around verse 14. Whereas the NRSV reads, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us," Eugene Peterson renders that the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. "We saw the glory with our own eyes," he goes on, "the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish." It's a good rendering. He moved into the neighborhood. The NRSV's lived, it's not inaccurate, but it suggests living in a general place, not a specific place. In some ways, the King James, when it rendered, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us," suggests more the sense of a dwelling place, which is what's suggested here. The term that is used by John is an interesting term because it includes the word for tent. In a sense, it's like the intensement. The Word became flesh and was intented among us. It dwelt in a tent. This verb eskenosen includes this term skenos or skene for tent. In 2/3 of the references in the Old Testament, this term refers to a tent that is a tabernacle. The place where God dwelt. It was expected that in a tent there would be the dwelling of God. And so it would make sense to someone listening to this that, "And the Word became flesh and was intented," or intented. You hear that verb, eskenosen, and you think, oh, well, God became flesh and dwelt in the temple, of course. That's what I would expect the ending to be. The Word, God came among us and lived in the temple. But John writes, "And the Word became flesh and was intended in us." Not in the temple, but in the people. God came to dwell not in a building, but in humanity. Paul picks this up in Ephesians 2 when he talks about the temple as us, that we become the dwelling place for God. But John declares that God did not come to live in a building, but to occupy us, to move into our neighborhood, according to Eugene Peterson. to dwell among humanity. Sometimes I think we in the church get this inside out. Sometimes we get the church inside out. Sometimes we think the church is for us, and the church is for God to dwell with us cozily inside the church. But the word came to dwell not in the building, but among the people, not to be held captive in the temple. Last May, I got to meet a remarkable pastor named Emil Zaki. He was the pastor of the Kolali Presbyterian Church. There you see him. We met in Cairo. Here he is in a group of pastors, and I like his mischievous smile. You see him there on the end. Well, a young pastor refers to him as a Yoda Jedi Master pastor. The story might help you understand why. It's the story of the Kolali Presbyterian Church, where he served. It's also known as the Inside Out Church. The story is told by Anne Zeki. Anne is his daughter. Here's a picture of her in Egypt with our own Aaron Dunnigan. But here's the scoop, Anne says, from my dad. I'm going to read a bit of this so I get the story right. In September 1992, the Kolali Presbyterian Church, which is in downtown Cairo, suffered major damage from earthquake that racked Egypt. Because of the age of the building, this church was established in 1872 and is the second oldest Presbyterian church in the Presbytery of Cairo. Because of its age and the quality of its foundation, which was rocks, and its walls and ceiling, which were wood and bricks, the walls cracked, the ceiling fell in, and the place was a mess. Due to complicated government restrictions, it was hard to build a new church. In order to get a building permit in Cairo, you had to have a permit signed by the president. President Mubarak had to sign your church's building permit. It's extremely restrictive on church building. And so the session decided, with the high costs and the trouble it would be, they would just remodel, and they only applied for a license to renovate. It would still be difficult, but it was less complicated. Anne writes, "We were surprised that the city officials allowed us to start the work immediately, even before the official papers take their bureaucratic rounds, because the city officials didn't want worship to be disturbed or interrupted." I heard that. I thought, well, that's interesting. Muslim city officials, it turns out. There was one Muslim city official processing their papers who knew about the history of the church and appreciated the church, how the church had offered free school for Kolali's Muslim and Christian students, elementary students, since the 1870s through the 1950s. They were known for this. It was later replaced by free tutoring for all children since 1983 till now, and also free medical services to all neighbors, including Muslims, since 1981. So with this permission they had from this grateful city official, they began this paperless process. Their neighbors were glad that they got the permission to do it, because the neighbors appreciated the church also, because the church had given to the poor in the community for many years. And Anne writes, "God gave us favor." Meanwhile, a well-known Muslim architect had heard about what happened, and he volunteered his services to help this church that he knew of as the Ramadan Breakfast Table Church. It was called that because this Kolali church had gained a reputation for, during the month of Ramadan, every year, the members would set up a table in front of the church with free food for anyone passing by, for Muslim passerbyers, as she said, and the poor to break their fast. Guests, compliments of the church. So not only did the architect do all the work and the drawings for free, but he showed up to supervise the work as they were rebuilding. And this was not without some cost, because the work they did between midnight and 6 a.m. The reason being that they didn't have the official permit yet, and so they didn't want to draw the attention of spies or secret detectives or police that might show up, because the official papers wouldn't come for months later. So while the members would stay up all night and work hauling rubbish out and taking building materials in, their Muslim and Christian neighbors stood watch for them out on the street to alert them if officials would come. And it was the brilliance of that Muslim architect that assessed that the building was not fit for renovation. It was too far gone. So he ordered the building materials, but then used it to build a new church building inside of the old structure. So new walls, new ceiling on a new foundation of concrete, not rocks and wood. Months and months of manual labor through the night. And finally, one day, she says, we peeled off our old church. There stood a beautiful, new, sturdy church building, just like that. She writes, all things were made new. In so many physical and spiritual ways, God gave us favor. A few days later, Anne's words again, a few days later, my father was called into the police station on charges that would land him for 6 months in jail and a hefty fine of 1,000 Egyptian pounds, a large sum for an urban church, a small urban church. The church prayed and prayed, and when he showed up at the police station, determined not to lie when asked any question, the Muslim officer on duty recognized my dad as the kind man who read Psalms at my father's funeral a couple of years ago. The young police officer didn't even get around to asking any questions. He dropped the jail time and asked for only 1,000 pounds. Once again, Anne says, God gave us favor. By the time that the papers came for renovating the building, they were done. But her dad didn't want to waste the official paper, so he had this idea to use it to build a second floor on top of the now sturdy first floor, because they had concrete pillars that could take it. And so they did this with official paper in hand. They built a large meeting hall, a kitchen, a bathroom, a library, and 2 more Sunday school rooms, and all in the daylight. Finally, the building next door collapsed due to earthquake damage, and the church worked together to purchase it for a reasonable price, and they demolished it, and to this day it provides a park space for neighborhood children in a place where a very dense population and neighborhood doesn't give much room to play. Anne writes again, God gave us favor. Pastor Zeki's daughter, Anne, who wrote this, is a candidate. She's graduated from seminary, and she's the first woman ever, she's poised to be the first woman ever in the Presbyterian Church in Egypt to be ordained as a teaching elder. She's a close friend of Mark Labberton and was in town recently as a worship leader and a colloquium speaker at Mark's inauguration as president of Fuller Seminary. I sent her a copy of this picture and said, good photo bomb. Her head's sitting on the lectern there. General Assembly moderator Neil Pressa has also invited her to be a preacher at the next General Assembly, one of the 4 guest preachers coming, and she will be powerful. I'm looking forward to that. When the church's neighbors become the church's defenders, it's because the church has come to be known by the neighbors as on the side of the neighbors. Emmanuel Presbyterian Church here in Long Beach, in the past, had a history of annoying their neighbors because the church has no parking lot. So on Sunday mornings, church members took all the parking spaces. One Christmas Eve years ago, they asked some of the neighbors, would you mind leaving these spaces open because it's just for Christmas Eve and we have some older members who need some consideration for this? And the neighbor said, "No, it's our parking space too." Ouch. But today, after several years of the church loving the neighborhood, getting involved in the neighborhood, things have changed. Arising out of one woman's passion, one woman in the church, passionate about serving the hungry. A weekly food pantry now serves many people, but it's brought neighbors in from outside the church who want to be involved in giving. Neighbors are bringing their children, saying, "Can we bring our children to this place to help them learn about service?" Partnerships are being formed. Neighbors have come to appreciate this church. The neighbors have become advocates for the church. And these days, on Christmas Eve, without needing to ask, the parking spaces are open. Christ Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach made a commitment to being good neighbors to their local elementary school. In an era where schools grow suspicious of religious involvement, the church has come to love, or the school has come to love this church because the church has loved the school. Through many hours of tutoring and manual labor to do physical improvements on the campus and being good neighbors, the school now welcomes the church with open arms. The school administration even credits the church for helping raise the test scores of the students in the school because the church moved into the neighborhood. At La Church in La Mission, where Aaron Dunnigan is the pastor of this effervescent group, the curious neighbors and the participants in this ministry are the most zealous evangelists. They're the ones who plead with their friends and families to come because of how much this community of faith means to them. Whether it's at the store, at the bars, or in the restaurant around town, you just see them effervescent about what's happening, pleading with their neighbors and friends to come. It reminds me of the Samaritan woman in John 4 who she couldn't help but tell what had happened. "Come and see this man who told me everything I did." She couldn't help herself. It's happening in La Mission because Pastor Aaron and the Knot Church are not trying to drive their neighbors into the building, but she has moved into the neighborhood. New Hope Presbyterian Church made this commitment to provide God's gift of music to Willard Middle School in one of Santa Ana's poor neighborhoods. The church provided music instructors and then began to provide money for bringing in faculty, and then the church started to provide opportunities for students to perform with world-class musicians, and it's gotten to the point where the school and the school district are so happy about this church that they publicly broadcast how thankful they are for this partnership. I remember 35, 40 years ago as a youth pastor when I was starting to get kicked off of high school campuses, when Lisa Smith, a veteran of youth ministry, is remembering this, when people, schools just didn't want church people on the campus anymore. But now, just a few weeks ago, this band director at Santa Ana High School, knowing who I am, he says, "Would you please come to school and help one of our kids with guitar? He's just starting in the band, and you could really help him." To be invited like that, with open arms, to be trusted as the church by the school, it happens because the church has moved into the neighborhood. When the temple of the church shifts from being our destination dwelling place to being our place to encounter and worship God and then be sent out from by God into the neighborhood, then we are becoming God's missional church. Ann Zaki said this. She closes her story of her father's adventure at Kolali Presbyterian Church with this thought: can an earthquake be a blessing? Grace will turn any tragedy into a blessing. when we are attentive to God's voice amidst difficult circumstances, and when we humbly obey and daringly step into our calling to a witness and our calling to unity. Thank you, Ann Zaki, and for this missional adventure into the neighborhood. Thanks be to God. Amen.